Previously, in Hedge Knights, Tangier and Madzi searched other glades for salix trees. A section of the northern farm was converted for nutrifungus. The Adlets started a massive undertaking to surround their glade with salix trees and walls to act as a boundary against raiders and pollution. Lazarus and Tangier headed out together to fetch even more salix trees as part of a romantic autumn getaway. Episode 27: Odd Attackers. Sappo was concerned that with the temperatures dipping ever colder, the two southern cycloid fields and the wheat field were at risk of succumbing to frost, and he chalked the Devilstrand field up to a total loss because it hadn't grown nearly enough to even harvest. He decided to have a good night's rest before risking his own health in the morning to harvest as much as he could, as he still hadn't recovered from the trek to the west. With Tangier and Lazarus's expected return with additional salix trees, Megahoof thought it was the right time to designate the area around the boundary trees to absorb excess pollution, allowing the trees inside the curtain wall to purify the area, before also being moved to the perimeter. The pollution from the renovations continued to creep back into the keep, so the arrival of more trees would be a godsend. About halfway home from harvesting trees, Lazarus and Tangier spotted an enemy scout trudging through the deep marsh. Lazarus joked with Tangier that this is exactly why he wears his heavy armor at all times, and Tangier sarcastically but lovingly replied,
"Oh, aren't you my knight in shining armor, dearest Lazarus?"
Years ago, the two would be terrified of getting caught by a monstrous scout, but after dozens of skirmishes since, they both were grizzled veterans of combat. Lazarus told Tangier not to even bother trudging too far in the muck to chase him down. He'd come to them, saving them the effort. Even without his sword, there wasn't much a visitor could do with a short knife against Lazarus's thick and well-forged armor. After just a few arrows and swipes from a harvesting axe, the scout collapsed into the polluted muck of the marsh. Lazarus crudely gestured towards the scout, and then flirtatiously apologized to Tangier for his less than knightly demeanor. Despite the scout posing no real threat to the couple, they were concerned for the rest of the Adlets, because often scouts found near the keep meant that a staged attack would be coming soon, so they quickly packed the caravan to warn the others. The two arrived back home and shared the news of their success of obtaining additional trees, as well as a warning about the scout they saw just a few hours east of their glade. They told the others to be on high alert and exert caution when outside the curtain walls. Sappo told Lazarus he didn't look too well. He likely spent too much time in the blight and should rest up. Lazarus gently punched Sappo on the shoulder and told him he looked pretty ragged himself, and asked why he was out of quarantine. This reminded Sappo about the cycloid fields, and he told Lazarus it was due to the colder temperatures, and he was worried the cycloid and wheat would soon die of frost. They both would be needed to harvest the fields before quarantining a bit longer. Megahoof asked for a volunteer to help him relocate even more trees, using up almost all of the remaining hybrid extract. Hiroko jumped at the chance. He was a bit stir-crazy as a result of recovering from the trip west, but was also almost fully recovered. They'd depart as soon as they could do a quick health check on the bison to make sure their herd was also healthy for travel. Sappo took a break from harvesting cycloid to replant the salix trees in the south, spacing them out so their roots wouldn't overlap Megahoof asked Madzi to talk more about the ruins she had discovered in her time around the Ryza forest. She mentioned seeing many different structures. Most of the time, they were just small encampments of visitors. Strange, shiny, metallic buildings spewing green smoke were also common. They were often well guarded by strange, silvery beings who never spoke, slept, ate, or did anything else but patrol. Megahoof knew of these structures as they were quite easy to spot from great distance due to the bellows of toxic smoke. Rarely she would happen upon old Adlet Kingdom ruins, and they were usually swarming with visitors or other vicious creatures, and she never risked getting too close. The Adlet Kingdom ruins piqued Megahoof's interest, so he pressed her for details. Madzi mentioned a few such ruins she had spotted over the years. She thought the monsters were outfitting themselves with weapons and armor from the ruins, as they looked like castles or keeps once used by Adlet Kingdom militaries. Back on Hillinor Island, the seed bank was built into one such structure, and another had many of the journals, scriptures, and recipes that Megahoof had been researching for the Glade members. He asked Madzi if she remembered where they were, and she asked for a map. She said she couldn't remember exactly where it was, but knew that one of the two ruins she had found was at a fork in a river, and then proceeded to circle two potential sites with some coal. She made sure that Megahoof understood that these were only her best guesses. She knew that they were in the southern Ryza forest, and also due south of most of the major roadways near a river fork. The other ruin she had seen, she said she couldn't place on the map. It was near a mountain range, and nothing on the map seemed to fit. This, for Megahoof, was as good a hunch as any. He had studied most of the ancient texts he had brought with him from Hillinora, and if the Adlets were to ever forge their own steel or cook more complex meals, he desperately needed more research material. Yet another waste rat clawing at the walls. The regular occurrence was becoming routine, but each time no less sad. Long-term exposure to pollution could cause people to go senile, even at a young age, or to get strange lumps on their body which led to death. Or in the most extreme cases, it could just kill you. Even the waste rats, which seemed well adapted to the toxins, could suffer being driven rabid and mad by the blight. Ralco and Megahoof were both awake far before sunrise and decided to make the most of the daylight hours by packing the caravan and getting ready to depart before dawn. They told the others they'd head back to the river to be easy to find in case the scout seen earlier wasn't just a lone wanderer. They told the other Adlets to stay on the lookout. Megahoof hugged both Judea and Vash, and then they set off eastward towards the riverbanks. Lazarus dragged his feet through the toxic fields of psychoid, struggling to harvest carefully as he was feeling lightheaded and dizzy from his exposure. Soon he'd need to take a break or risk collapsing in his heavy armor. But winter's chill nipped at his fingertips, and he knew the delicate leaves wouldn't withstand the cold much longer. Megahoof and Arelco arrived at a large clearing next to a river, full of healthy pine, birch, and poplar trees, with even some healthy heelroot growing in the meadow. Glades like this one were responsible for supporting what little life was left in the forests. They hitched their bison to a stake and searched for salix trees, two being spotted just to the north. Out of the blue, Arelco mentioned to Megahoof that after the winter he planned on departing from the keep to head east. This news surprised Megahoof. The thought of giving up a roof over your head and a pantry stocked full of food was nearly unbelievable, so all he could manage to do was ask why. Whatever Orelko's true motivations were, he'd not reveal them to Megahoof, and instead told Megahoof he wanted to search for new opportunities. Megahoof had some inkling of an idea why Orelko would want to leave, but instead of pressing for the truth, he just thanked him for his 2 years of hard work, making the keep fortified and thriving, and offered him a warm bed any time he wished to return. Orelko had one request: not to tell the others about him wanting to leave. He didn't want to justify his choice to the others for 2 long seasons ahead. A request Megahoof fully understood, so he agreed to keep it to himself. The two continued to dig in silence, other than the sounds of shovels hitting soil. Madzi took a break from quarrying slate and asked Lazarus what else she could do. Lazarus had just finished harvesting the psychoid, but didn't feel well and knew it needed to be hauled away into the pantry, so he suggested helping with that. She loved running around the keep and glade and was happy to assist. Orelko finished treating his Salix tree first and decided to take a nap, leaving the 3rd tree to Megahoof. Megahoof hoped to finish the 3 treatments before nightfall so they could return to the keep, but it was already getting fairly late. Tangier picked up where Madzi had left off, quarrying slate from underground. The masons had already used all of the slate in the stockpiles, so the rest of the wall would require freshly quarried and cut slate. Once Megahoof returned, Tangier thought to propose sending the bison out in search of slate chunks instead of Salix trees to help speed up the process. After spending countless hours brewing tea, Sapo and Megahoof had enough for 3 more extracts, but Sapo said that their medicine stockpile was far too depleted, and they'd have to wait for the heal root to mature instead. It took Megahoof 9 more hours of grueling work to dig up the last Salix tree and treat it. He finally had the chance to rest. Orelko had just woken up from sleeping off the rest of the day and wandered the old battlefield. After a quick nap, Megahoof felt ready to return to the keep, where he'd find a far more comfortable bed and better meals instead of roughing it in the forest. They packed up the caravan to return with 3 more trees. Megahoof thought to himself about Orelko's plan to leave the keep and wondered if he could have done anything differently. In Orelko's 2 years, he really hadn't made any friends, hadn't even truly connected with anyone. Megahoof knew that Madzi wasn't especially fond of him, but he doubted that she was the cause of his departure. His request wasn't all that different from the squires leaving Hillenora Island in search of fabled glades, so he'd be a hypocrite to judge him any further. Now that the psychoid was harvested, it was time to reap the wheat. Not all of the wheat was ripe enough for reaping, and they planned to leave the immature plants to either struggle to grow or die by frost instead of cutting it down. Just as the farmers predicted, the shorter growing season didn't allow for the devil strand to ripen. They would leave it in the soil as well. Perhaps it would survive the harsher winter temperatures and continue to grow next year. And if not, they could plant the devil strand field farms first, giving it as much time as possible to grow. Megahoof was exhausted and could barely drag himself back to the keep. Tangier noticed that Scorpio was left untethered and went to go fetch the bison. The quest for more trees was successful, and now they only had one spare hybrid extract left. Tangier asked Megahoof if she could send the bison out to fetch Slate, but Megahoof was simply too tired to even notice the inquiry, so she'd ask again once he got some more rest. The large marshes of the Bison Glade would make it difficult to plant a full perimeter of salix trees, so the farmers planned to plant trees as close to the edge of the water as possible for maximum coverage. The High Adlet Kingdoms had dredged marshes and designed moats, but the techniques they had used had been lost to time. Megahoof knew the deep marshes would become an issue if they wanted to fortify their boundary made of stone, but he needed more research material before being able to come up with a decent solution. Sapo noticed many of the Glade members were showing signs of toxic exposure and suggested those who felt ill sequester in the keep. Building the boundary wall would be difficult and taxing. The time spent in blighted soil was an unavoidable health risk, only mitigated by recovery time. The squires decided to reunite all the bison instead of separating Mojo and Lily. Soon they might be able to offer the bison large swaths of grazing land, and the Adlets also needed help hauling the heavy salix trees, so expanding the herd seemed like a good idea. The eastern section of salix trees were nearly finished being planted and designated as a third possible spot to dump excess pollution. The once small glade was becoming a lush grove of salix, and all of the new trees would be crucial in absorbing pollution from an expanding keep. The northern edge of the glade lacked salix trees, but Megahoof thought it might be possible to use the last extract to fetch one more tree and then move two trees that were inside the curtain walls to the north so the glade would have a decent boundary against encroaching smog pollution. Madzi zipped around the keep, collecting as much psychoid as she could manage, but even to the best of her efforts, she could barely make a dent in the abundant supply. She didn't want to ask for help, however. She enjoyed the break from quarrying slate. Tangier finally had the chance to ask Megahoof about collecting slate, and Megahoof thought it was a great idea. They would need to send a lot of people to help haul all of the chunks, so he said they'd get around to it once everyone had recovered from exposure. This would also give Megahoof a chance to fetch one last tree. Dave finally felt well enough to start helping with the construction of the boundary wall. Having spent almost a full season recovering from toxicity, he was rearing to get outside back into the blight that laid him up for so long. Tangier planned to excavate as much of the hillside mountains as she could to clear the way for the boundary wall. She didn't want the raiders to find a path traversing the mountains to circumvent their boundary wall. The wall wasn't meant to keep the monsters out, but instead to funnel them into killing fields overlooked by towers and Merlin walls. Driving rain threatened to rot the psychoid left in the fields, and Sappho insisted everyone who was healthy chip in to help haul it before it was lost. Now that the psychoid was hauled to the shelves and barrels, the Atlas scoured the glade for what little slate chunks were left. The boundary wall could of course be made of other stones, but the Adlets thought that tall looming black walls were more imposing than ones of cream-colored limestone or purple-hued granite, even if the granite was tougher. Nobody was sure if the high black walls paired with murder holes and arrow loops would intimidate the monsters, but they did know that the monsters would rout when their raids were thinned out by arrows and blades. After an exhaustive search, there wasn't much slate left in the hillsides except for what Tangier and Madzi could cut from the slate mountains. There was, however, plenty of timber, and much of the perimeter would have to be made of posts, bridges, and timber walls, unless of course they could figure out an efficient way to dredge the marshes. Even more ambrosia cropped up in the freshly reaped fields where wheat once stood. At this rate, the Adlets might even have to treat the ambrosia like a weed, cutting it back to make way for nourishing crops, because the bushes numbered to nearly 100. Smog rolled into the glade once again, and as unpleasant and unproductive as the smog was, it would be a good way to test to see if the Boundary Arboretum was effective in keeping the encroaching blight at bay. The scout that Lazarus and Tangier had killed may have been part of a larger group searching for prey, because a large raid party gathered to the southwest. The hatches were battened down, and Megahoof rallied the Adlet archers to muster and skirmish, engaging the raiders at a distance to thin out their numbers. Megahoof called for Lazarus to man the main gate and lure the monsters to approach before slamming the slab doors shut. Upon approach, the raiders were seen constructing, building their own defenses and other strange contraptions. Megahoof was curious what they were building, but he would rather not let them finish constructing likely weapons of war. It was time to engage and volley the enemies with everything they got. The Adlets rained arrows upon the raiders, goading them into a direct attack rather than whatever they had planned. Megahoof called for the archers to fall back to the Merlins. While sprinting through the side gate, they yelled to Lazarus to prepare, as the raid party was coming fast. The Adlets took up positions along the arrow loops, and Judea shouted for everyone to target enemies holding bows the walls could handle being battered by blades and axes. They also aimed for raiders closest to the main gate, hoping to slow them down and continue to lure them into the gatehouse. Lazarus shut the slab door, confusing the raiders as they no longer knew how to attack the Adlets. That is, except for one bowman who was overlooked firing upon the archers. Klein was struck, and the archers pivoted to target the ranged assailant. They unleashed a devastating volley of arrows, routing the raid party. The new quivers made it easier to fire more rapidly, and due to the tactical planning of Megahoof and Judea, most of the Adlets were spared far worse injuries. Sapo told Megahoof and Klein to rest while they fetched medicine, and Judea reopened the side gate doors to hunt the fleeing raiders and mercy kill the ones who fell but were still alive. The Adlets had never seen the monsters use what seemed to be siege weapons. Megahoof was still recovering from his wounds, but once he was better, they were sure he'd want to investigate the strange equipment the raiders had brought, and compare them to historical records to figure out what they had intended. While victorious, the coordinated attack of both scouts and siege party had the Adlets concerned that their boundary walls and arboretum were attracting more vicious raids. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights episode 27, Odd Attackers. I would like to thank all of my Patreon patrons for supporting this series and also voting in the latest polls. If you would like to support me as a content creator, you can also consider becoming a Patreon patron. A link can be found in the description of this video. I offer my Patreon patrons the ability to vote and influence my series, and also be named in them as well. If you'd like to support me as a content creator in other ways, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to everybody that helped to make this happen. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow Adlets.